second passage comes from the Gospel of Matthew. It's one that we hear quite often, especially from people who don't like being judged. Here's what it says. Jesus said, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take that speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." This is God's word for God's people. Mildred was the self-appointed monitor of the church's morals. Some would say she was the church gossip. Y'all know anybody like that? Whatever she was, she certainly did have the bad habit of sticking her nose into other people's business. And while the church's members did not approve of her extracurricular activities, they feared her enough they kept silent about it. Well, one day, Mildred accused George of being an alcoholic after she saw his pickup parked in front of the town's only bar all afternoon. George was a new member of the church. He didn't know Mildred yet. But Mildred, of course, knew all about George, and she emphatically told George and anyone else who would listen that everyone seeing his truck in front of that bar would know exactly what he was doing. George was a man of few words. He stared at her for a moment, and then he turned and walked away. He didn't explain himself, nor did he deny. He said nothing, which, to Margaret's great glee, was what she had hoped. Later that evening, George quietly parked his pickup in front of Mildred's house, walked home, and left it there all night. You gotta love George. Jesus said, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." Let's ask God to unpack both this Matthew passage and our Luke passage that Pastor Steve read earlier, so that we might apply it in our lives today, not only individually, but as a congregation. Would you pray with me? Lord, it's really hard not to make decisions about other people. At what point do we cross the line from discerning to judging? Open our hearts and our minds and give us guidance in this as we hear your word. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, Lord, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Judgmentalism is a social sin, and it's a disease of the spirit. It is the habit of constantly finding fault with what others say and do. While it appears that the critic assumes a superiority that entitles him or her to judge the failing of others, the very opposite is true. More often than not, the critic tears others down in order to build himself or herself up. Sometimes we judge others based on what we do not like in ourselves. I had a very good friend who pulled me aside one day when my children were young, and she said, "Kerrin, when you learn to love yourself, you're going to learn to love your daughter." I was so glad she shared that with me. Judgmentalism is the habit of making decisions about a person's intent or character or heart based on externals, based on appearances, based on circumstances, but not based on relationship. It's what the family of isms rely on. Have you heard some of those isms? Racism, genderism, sexism. How about clergyism? Y'all know you talk about a new pastor, right? It's without taking the time to know them that we make these assumptions based on our understanding and not the reality of who they are. Like being called an alcoholic when you park your pickup truck in front of the bar. The truth is, we never truly know the whole facts about the whole person, because we cannot read for ourselves their heart, we cannot read for ourselves their hurts, we cannot read for ourselves their life story or their character. And even if we could read all of these inner things, we couldn't see them with a neutral impartiality needed to make a fair and merciful judgment, because we ourselves are flawed human beings. And we're too easily swayed by our own shortcomings and our own hurts. Jesus said it is impossible for us to see the full truth about other people because our own stuff gets in the way. And we're to deal with our own blindness first before we have the chutzpah to point out the blindness of someone else. Some people take the instructions of Jesus to mean that God's people are never ever to come to the conclusion that others have a problem, and if we do in ourselves come to that conclusion, we're never supposed to say anything about it. Now the problem with that understanding is that we are all fallible human beings, and the reality is we need feedback from other people to help us treat other people better, to help us see other things more clearly, and to see the destructive behaviors that are in us that we ourselves cannot or will not acknowledge. In fact, the Apostle Paul, insisted that Christians must discern in each other at least the behaviors which are destructive and give feedback grounded in the love of God for that person. But it is only in the context of relationship with God and each other that they are to do this. To let sin go absolutely unchecked in our brothers and sisters is to allow sin to destroy them and, quite frankly, the community. And that is not a loving action, nor is it merciful, and nor is it just. Jesus does give us a framework from which we're to work for God's people to use in our lives together. He tells people about a tree bearing fruit. It's a metaphor. Discerning fruits is different from judging in that fruit takes time and attention to watch, to sample, to experience. And likewise, discerning happens over time in the context of relationship. But judgment happens in the moment without the benefit of that relationship. Discerning gives time for the discerner to examine himself or herself. Judgment makes a decision about the other person with prejudice. The truth is, over time, for every single one of us, our speech and our actions reveal what we really believe. It reveals our true attitudes. It reveals our motivations, so that others can at least see in part where our heart is, what our motivation is, what our intent is, based on observation of behavior patterns. And they, in turn, can lovingly respond with feedback for us out of love and care for us. But without time and relationship, we cannot see enough to make a fair and grace-filled decision. Because without justice and fairness, grace deteriorates into permissiveness. And without grace, justice hardens into cruelty. So the only one qualified to truly judge the heart is God. And God has chosen to give mercy to those who call upon his name, even us. And when we choose to harshly judge one another, then we have also failed to understand with gratitude how God has so graciously dealt with us. And when we harshly judge one another, we in effect reject God's grace in our own lives, and that harsh judgment becomes ours to bear when we stand unforgiven before God because we have rejected his grace. I want to let that sink in. When we judge harshly, we reject the grace of God in our own lives, and we stand unforgiven before God. How quickly we forget the price that was paid on the cross on our behalf. How easy it is to attempt to be God by judging other people. How painful it will become as the disease of judgmentalism erodes our relationships with others and with God and rots our soul. What kind of fruit are you bearing? How has the log in your eye led you to make harsh judgments of others? I have good news. Jesus knows our hearts and loves us anyway. The time for judgment is coming, but it is not here yet. And Jesus offers us the gift of his love, of his mercy, of his grace, if only we would admit that we really cannot live without him, and if we would only receive him. Jesus meets us at the table of mercy where all are welcome. And when we break bread and share the cup, we remember the price that was paid for us. And we remember that Jesus is here with us even now. So I invite you to prepare your hearts to come to the table of mercy, to come at the Lord's invitation, and to receive him and the grace that he offers.